Today is our guest, the prominent world-class economist, author of the economist bestseller Capital in the 21st Century, French professor Thomas Piketty. Mr. Piketty, allow us to introduce ourselves. My name is Jana Bobosikova. I am journalist and former member of the European Parliament. This is my colleague, Hanna Lipovská, economics analyst and lecturer at the Prague University of Finance and Administration. Mr. Professor, this year the Harvard University Press published your latest book, The Brief History of Equality. Could you define, please, what do you, in your work, mean as equality?
This is a very broad notion, including political equality, social, economic equality. And to make it clear, let me say that, so this book is much shorter than my previous books, which were like 1,000 pages long. This one is only 250 pages long, and I have tried to focus on what I see in the end as the most important lesson from my research on the history of equality and inequality. And the most important conclusion is the idea that in the long run we do have a movement toward more equality, which begins. It's not been there forever. It's not since Neolithic times. It's grounded in history. It started, say, at the end of the 18th century. With the French Revolution, the US Revolution to some extent. This starts with the abolition of the privileges of the aristocracy, which marks the beginning of the end of status-based inequality and equality of rights. This also starts with the slave revolt in Saint-Domingue in 1791, which is sort of the beginning of the end of colonial societies. Now, what you can see with these two examples is that, this is a very broad notion of equality. So, it includes basic rights, political rights, together with economic and social rights. What you can see also is that this is a process that has been going on, over the following 2 centuries. So, in the 19th century, you have the final abolition of slavery, you have the rise of the labor movement, the rise of universal suffrage, first for men in the 19th century and for women in the 20th century, decolonization in the 20th century, rise of labor movement, social security, progressive taxation, decolonization, civil rights in the US, end of apartheid in the late 20th century. And this is a process, which continues today with the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. And, you can see that we still have today, we live in more equal societies, of course, than, at the end of the 18th century. But, we still live in societies where, the power of money is very important, for instance, in our democracy. So, we are not, we don't have aristocratic privileges anymore, but there are other privileges, and the billionaire, can influence elections, can influence media, have more political voice, more political influence, in a way that it's different from the Ancien Régime or from the property-based democracy of the 19th century, but it's still very imperfect. And I think when people 50 years from now or 100 years from now will look at our democratic system today, maybe they will say, well, okay, it's democracy, but, it's sort of intermediate between 19th century democracy and more real democracy, which hopefully will be in place in 50 years or 100 years. And this is the same for international inequality. We've made progress, as compared to the time of slavery and colonialism, but, we still have enormous inequality between the North and the South. We still have enormous racial discrimination within country. So this is the kind of long-run movement toward more equality that I'm talking about. So this is a very broad, multidimensional notion of equality. And this is, an ever-going process that is primarily based on political transformation, political mobilization, social struggles, and this is going to continue.
You've mentioned the 2 historical breakup processes, both revolutions, the French one and the Russian, and you've mentioned Black Lives Matter movement, Me Too movement, and so on. But how do you consider nowadays crucial events? There's the coronavirus crisis on the one hand, and the Russian-Ukraine war on the other hand. So, what can be expected impact on the equality or inequality in the world, or at least in the European continent?
Yeah, these two events, the COVID and the Ukraine war, unfortunately, are not, they are not emancipation movement to begin with. They are catastrophe of a different nature, of course, but to begin with. So, the COVID is just a pure catastrophe. So, of course, we can learn from catastrophe to improve our health system, etc. But to begin with, this is just bad. This is purely bad. So we don't need, I don't believe in those stories that we need catastrophes to make progress. Catastrophes are not necessary and they are not sufficient because they can also lead to very bad political outcomes, to the rise of nationalism. With Ukraine, it's a different and much more complex story, which has some resemblance with many patterns of nationalism in the past, unfortunately, and with the fact that a very powerful state capacity, state power, can be used for the better or the worst. And that's also one of the lessons from my history of equality, is that state power and state centralization, is not good or bad in itself. It depends, who controls the state and for what political project. And, in my book, I tell the story of Sweden, which we view today as sort of a very egalitarian country with a state capacity that is used to have a progressive taxation of income and wealth to pay for a good welfare state system. But for a long time, the state capacity of Sweden was used, not to invade Ukraine, but was used, to protect extreme inequality with, a system of voting rights, until 1910, where, rich people, rich men, would have between 1 and 100 votes, depending on how wealthy they are. And even in municipal elections, there was no upper limit, so you had several dozen Swedish municipalities where, only one individual had a majority of the vote. And this was Sweden until 1910. And even multinationals today, wouldn't dare asking for such a system. I mean, they would love to have a system like this in the countries in the global south or global north where they operate, but they don't even dare asking for this kind of voting right. Sometimes they find other ways to get the same outcome, but the very fact that they don't even dare asking for that is interesting. Now, this was Sweden until 1910, and then you had big, trade union mobilization, Social Democratic Party victory in 1932, which sort of put the state capacity of Sweden and its administration and its register to measure income and wealth to the service of a completely different project, where you would register income and wealth not to distribute more political power, but to make these people pay for a system of healthcare and education that is, that is not perfect. And we've seen with COVID the limitation of our healthcare system, but still it was much better than everything else that had been done at that time. So I'm saying this because, today, the way the Russian state is using its state capacity is of course, the worst example you can think. And we viewed from Western Europe, we think of the wars, between France and Germany, World War I, World War II, about the frontier between France and Germany, which caused 2 world wars and 3 big wars between France and Germany between 1870 and World War II. Except that here, of course, Russia is 3 times more populated than Ukraine. So, it is just brute force, trying to find a future for a completely irrational and insane view of the world. Yeah, this is very sad. At the same time, I think maybe it was the way the Soviet Union ended was too simple. It looked very, nothing really bloody, dramatic happen, except in ex-Yugoslavia, of course, but for the rest of the ex-Soviet Union was sort of preserved from extreme forms of violence and civil war, in spite of the dismantling of a large political community, which, despite all its shortcomings, had also at some point some kind of universalist ideal, at least in theory, and managed, as compared to the Tsarist regime before 1970, managed to achieve a number of successes in terms of mass education and mass industrialization. Very quickly ended up in the authoritarian nightmares, which we all know about. And today the Russian state is, at least as it is headed, as an imagination about the future of Russia, which is tragically nihilistic and self-defeating and very, very dangerous. Yeah, this is part of the complex history, of state building, state capacity, which can, again, centralized state power, can achieve the best and the worst. But this is not going to end up here. And I think what also we need to remember in rich Western countries is that at a general level, this is also part of what you get, when you believe that, generalized market competition between countries, between people, between territories is sufficient in itself, to deliver sort of universal social harmony. And, it doesn't work like that. Within Ukraine and within Russia, you have some territories, some regions, in particular in the east of Ukraine, which don't necessarily feel that market integration with Western Europe is going to benefit them, is going to help them to find the proper situation. So we have to, right now the priority is certainly to help, Ukraine to fight the war, but we also need to think about, the more balanced economic system and a more balanced, international order, so that every country, every region, including regions within Ukraine, within Russia.
You suggest democratic socialism as an arrangement that leads to greater equality. According to you, how can the democratic socialism be achieved? Why? And is possible or not?
Yeah, I mean, not only this is possible, but we have already made a very substantial progress in this direction, over the past 2 centuries, and in particular over the course of the 20th century. Despite all the catastrophes and despite all the everything bad that happened, there's been a movement toward more equality. And what I put under the label of democratic socialism and participatory socialism is very much in the continuation of some of the transformations that have happened between, say, if you compare the capitalism of today with the capitalism of 1910 or 1913, this really has nothing to do. Today we live in a world where we have, in the most developed countries of Europe, you have a welfare state which is 45, 50, 55% of national income. We have much more equality of income and also of wealth, although it has been more limited, the movement toward wealth equality, as compared to 100 years ago. So there's been, this achievement. We've had progressive taxation, the rights, the legal system defining the right of property owners have nothing to do today. In 1910, you could fire a worker, reduce the wage, fire a tenant as you want. Today, it's not perfect, of course, but the notion of what it, what kind of power you have as an owner and non-owner, have been completely redefined. And so, I would say, so the kind of participatory socialism, democratic socialism that I have in mind, of course, is very different from the system, as compared to the system we have today. But I would say, it's not more different to the system we have today than the system we have today is different from the kind of, very authoritarian, unequal, patriarchal, colonial capitalism that we had in 1910. So if you look at the transformation between 1910 and 2000, 2020, what I put under the label of participatory socialism, if it happens by 2050 or 2080, it will be in the continuation of this movement. So it will include much more workers' rights. So, it will include, at least 50% of voting rights in the board of all companies, small or large, for workers' representative, just as workers, as investors in labor, independently from any shares in the capital in the company. And in addition, within the 50% of voting rights going to shareholders, there will be a maximum share of voting rights that a single shareholder could have in a large company, say no more than 5% or 10% of voting rights for a single shareholder in a company with 100 workers or more, but you can define different formula. In addition, there will be permanent redistribution of wealth with a minimum inheritance for all that will come in addition to basic income, free education and healthcare, and very extensive welfare state, finance through progressive taxation of income, wealth, and carbon emissions. This is fairly ambitious, but I think you don't need this to be adopted in every country at the same time. I think this can happen, gradually. Each individual country and region of the world can move in this direction as its own pace. We don't, all countries don't. You don't need a world government. You don't need all countries doing everything at the same speed. What's important for this to be possible is that, of course, you cannot at the same time move in this direction of participatory and democratic socialism and take free trade and free capital flows as given without any condition. So I am not against exchange of goods and services and circulation of capital and labor. Well, I am more for circulation of labor than circulation of capital. But I am not against all this form of circulation at the condition that each country can put condition to this circulation. So, you need fiscal cooperation, you need social cooperation, you need environmental protection. And so it's clear that, if you continue to have unconditional free trade and free capital flows without any condition, then this cannot work. But this is, nobody forces us to be in such a system. And so we have to, that's clearly an important precondition. So we have to build, a new form of sort of internationalist approach to, the global order and international integration, where, the circulation of goods and services and investment comes not as an objective in itself, but comes after, has to come together with explicit objective in terms of social justice, environmental justice, fiscal justice, educational justice, and it cannot come, separately as a objective.
Here in Prague, in the Czech Republic, we've experienced so-called centralized Soviet-style command economy, and we naturally ask ourselves, why should it be this time different?
Yeah, well, the kind of democratic socialism and participatory socialism I have in mind has, of course, nothing to do with, Soviet communism and state socialism, like what has been experimented in Russia, in Eastern Europe, or in China today. It has nothing to do because it is a much more decentralized view of political, social, economic organization. It's entirely based, of course, on pluralist election, on workers' powers in companies, economic democracy, workers' rights, trade union rights. So it is inspired, by the successes of, countries like, social democratic regime in Sweden or Germany, US progressive taxation under Roosevelt, electoral pluralism in all of these countries, and this is trying to push further this sort of social democratic model. So if you want, democratic socialism in my approach, or participatory socialism, is really the continuation of social democracy in the 21st century, but much more ambitious, much more demanding, but it is in the continuation. So I will say, the social democratic model of today is already very different from capitalist model of 1910, and democratic socialism, is sort of the next step 50 years later or 100 years later. So, I think it's important to think about the long run and not just to be thinking about the next election and the next week and the next year, because, of course, what I'm describing is not going to happen next week. So then you have to define steps, and you have to, to have political strategy to see, what's possible within a given country, within a given time frame. But if you don't know where you want to go in the long run, you're not going to go anywhere, even in the short run. So I think it's important to reopen this discussion, to recognize, of course, the gigantic failures of state socialism, Soviet socialism. And, for me, this was very important in my own personal trajectory and intellectual evolution. But at the same time, to recognize the successes of social democratic regime in Sweden, under Roosevelt, in Germany, in France, in all sorts of countries. In India, there are all sorts of things to learn about anti-discrimination policy in the democratic parliamentary system of India. This is something in Europe. Sometimes people feel they have nothing to learn from this, but I think in fact they have something to learn. Although there are lots of problems as well. And I think this is also part of the coming ideological competition with the system of sort of state socialism in China, which to me is a complete opposite extreme to the kind of decentralized participatory socialist models that I am describing. But I think this is the proper response to the Chinese challenge, because if the Western countries, if all they have to propose is a sort of hyper-capitalist, selfish system to the world, I think they will actually be in a relatively weak position in the future and in the coming decades in the global ideological competition with China and also with Russia for that matter. Because, the lessons about social justice and democracy that Western countries are constantly giving to the rest of the world, are sometimes very difficult to hear from the point of view of someone in West Africa or in India or in Brazil. So I think, Western countries have to be modest. They have to push, their social achievement as their main assets, but they have to be modest about their perfect democratic model, etc., which, as I said, is still very imperfect. They have to improve it at the same time as they propose a more equitable economic model, a tax regime to countries in the South, and at the same time as they confront, the legacy of their own, the way they became rich through colonialism, through slavery, and through environmental pollution. Because, of course, the cumulated carbon emission of countries in the North, represent the vast majority of the historical carbon emission, and the countries in the South, typically India, are countries in sub-Saharan Africa, are going to pay the higher cost for this. And so, if all the Western countries do is to give lessons about democracy and justice to the rest of the world, I think they will not manage to convince anyone. And that's part of the reason why today, many of these countries in the South are actually not supporting the West in the Ukraine war with respect to Russia. So defining another development model and another model of democratic socialism pursuing the achievement of social democracy in 20th century Europe and to a lesser extent North America is also very important for this geopolitical reason.
May I ask one small last question? Which country is nearest to democratic socialism?
We always think of Sweden and Nordic Europe, and indeed there is a lot to learn from these countries. But at the same time, I should say there's a lot to learn from many different countries, and we have to be. Our main enemy is nationalism, intellectual nationalism or nationalism of all sorts. So we have to learn from everybody. There are problems also with Nordic countries, including the fact that in the past 2 or 3 decades, they have played the game of tax competition. They've not been very constructive about proposing some cooperation and global cooperation to change the international tax system. They are a bit, they are very much centered on their own sort of nation state, but I think they are not sufficiently internationalist in a way. So there are strong limitations also there. So we have to be very open and looking at how large federation work. For instance, I think we have to, the European Union has to learn by looking at how the Indian Federation is working. That's a little country with 1.3 billion people, and they managed to adopt a common federal income tax, federal corporate tax. Even the African Union or the West African Economic Union, for that matter, has rules about how to prevent tax competition. They cannot have a corporate tax rate below 25%, in West Africa, in order to limit tax competition, which in the European Union, we are not even able to impose to Ireland and Luxembourg. So, I think the issue of democratic federalism and democratic socialism, is an issue where we have to learn from different parts of the world, and there's not one single model to follow.
Mr. Piketty, thank you very much for your time. Thank you.